Hi there, Heather Steves here, and today I want to share this fun little mini album that I made using a Paper Rose 6x6 paper pack. And it's a very simple method which I learned at a recent crop. So to start this album, you take all of your 6x6 pages and you score them at 2 inches or 4 inches, depending on which side. So that is what I'm working on here. You're only going to see one side, so you could actually make this album using single-sided paper. It doesn't need to be double. So I'm just double checking how I want my pages to go together, scoring them all and then folding them and then putting them in the order that I want so that I have the patterns facing each other that I want facing each other. Then once I've got them all folded, I'm going to start to assemble the album. So the assembly of this album is pretty straightforward. I've got all my pages there ready to go. I'm going to take my first two and I'm going to use score tape. I'm going along the fold and then I'm going along the short side. And then that's going to create a little pocket so that I can slide a photo or a card in that pocket. So I'm just lining them up and then I pull the backing off of my score tape and that gives me my first page. Now next up, I'm punching a half circle in that top of that bigger page. I'm lining it up on my craft mat because my circle punch actually has the little halfway indicators so that I can line it up nice and straight and get it centered. So next up, I'm going to take that larger page and I'm going to put score tape on the two long sides and then the bottom, and then I'm sticking those two together, and then that creates a pocket at the top. So I'm just going through and I'm just going to show you the process again. I'm going to tape up the three sides on the short piece and then I'm going to line it up. And you'll notice when I'm doing this, I just pull a little piece of the backing of my score tape off. I line everything up and then I pull the rest of the backing off. And that just helps me to keep things a little bit straighter. But of course it doesn't always work perfectly, so you just take your scissors and trim it up and make it nice and even. I'm going to punch that half circle again, and there are the little marks, so that helps me to line things up a lot easier. So now my album's all assembled here and you see that little flip through. This paper pack came with these lovely cut apart sheets. It also came with 3 pieces of each paper. So it was easy to just set aside one each of the cut apart sheets and then still be able to use the patterns on the back side of them. So that's what I'm doing here, and I'll just skip forward because you don't need to watch me cut apart every single one of these sheets. So this last sheet had some cute little sayings, and I wanted to actually do something a little bit different instead of just cutting them out in squares. So I went through all of my dies and I pulled out a bunch of little ones that I thought were going to work with this. And you can see that I've made some tickets, some other little shapes. I've got this fun little shape here. I don't even know what it's called. And so I did all of those using little different die cuts. So as I finish cutting all of these apart, I'm going to set them aside because this album is actually a gift for someone. So I'm not going to have photos to put in there. So I won't be able to really embellish the pages, or I don't want to embellish the pages until there's photos in it. I think it will work better that way. So I'll just set all these aside, and then once I have the photos, then I'll go ahead and I'll start to use all of these little cut apart pieces for embellishments. So now that everything's all cut apart, I want to start to figure out photos and mats. So I measured this little side pocket, and I can fit a 3x4 photo, but I can actually fit it on a mat that's 3.5 by 4.5. So I went ahead and cut a bunch of mats of that size. And then before I attach some of my pages together, I actually measured the space inside where the score tape sits on those pocket from the top pages, and I can actually fit a 3.25 by 5.5 little page in there. So I've cut up a bunch of those, and that's what I'm going to go ahead and put in those pockets. And then I can add some different size photos. I'll maybe do like 3x3 photos on there, or 3x2, or I don't know what. I'll wait and see when I get the photos what I end up deciding to use there. So next up is the fun and a little bit scary part of the project, where I'm going to make a cover for this album using some Kraftex. So I've never actually used Kraftex before, so this was a bit of an experiment for me. So I had made a little bit of a pattern ahead of time so that I knew a bit of what I was doing. So I had a 6.5 by 12-inch piece. I scored it at 1.5 inches to create that little flap on the left there so that that's where my album would slide into. My next score was at 4.25 inches and then an additional 5/8 of an inch for the spine. And then after that, I realized that I still had it at 6.5 inches tall, and that was a little bit too big, and I think I was a little bit crooked on my initial cut. So I trimmed that off there on the trimmer, and now I'm just attaching this other flap. I had another little piece of the Kraftex, and I'm just kind of securing it with some clips because that's the flap that the other side of the album is going to slide into. So now I needed to figure out what I was going to use to decorate this book with. So I had a little piece of scrap Kraftex, and I pulled out some close to my heart inks, and I'm trying them out with this stencil. And I also wanted to try the distressed oxide inks and see what that would do with the stencil. But one, I didn't like the color, and two, it's going to take too long for those to dry. So I also tried a lighter close to my heart ink. And then I pulled out some gloss spray. So I had a Heidi Swapp one, a Dina Wakley one. So I'm giving those a try. And then I also have the Tim Holtz Distress spray stain, the metallic ones. So I've given those all a try. And then I need to stamp a title on here because I want to put something on the front of my book. So what I realized afterwards was that the one side actually stamps a little bit better than the other. I wouldn't say it's necessarily the best. But both sides are different because they both have different textures. So that's just something to keep in mind. But I had already kind of scored everything and set it up. So the one side that I had, I just thought I'm just going to go with it. So I did settle on the close to my heart ink, and I've stenciled all of that. And then I'm going to stamp it. So I decided to use my stamp platform so that I could stamp it multiple times, and then maybe I would get a little bit crisper of an image. And I also used the Distressed Oxide black ink because I thought it might be a little bit darker and stronger. The only problem was I didn't really plan very well because it doesn't dry right away. So I went back and I stenciled a little bit darker of a gray color in the corners of those hearts, but then that's where I got some ink on my hands, or the stencil. So then that just made me think that I'll have to do something with that. So I finished highlighting the corners of those hearts. And once that was done, then I ended up inking the edges of the front cover just to give it a little bit more of a distress and a definition. And then I got out my heat tool just to dry that title so that I didn't make any more of a mess. So I felt like the cover still needed something else on it. So I found this lovely little border stamp, and I'm stamping that with the black ink as well. So next up, I grabbed my splatter box, and I'm going to use some Heidi Swapp Color Shine, and I'm just taking the lid out, and I'm using that to splatter the cover. It doesn't dry very quickly though, so I'm using the paper towel to kind of pick up some of it, and then I actually ended up off camera drying it with my heat tool. And once it was dry, I went over to my sewing machine and I sewed a border around just with regular black sewing thread, but it was kind of cheap, so I think it broke quite a few times because of that. So I had a lot of knots to tie. So yeah, instead of actually going back and forth with your sewing machine like you would normally on clothes to anchor your ends, you just pull them through the back and then just tie them in a knot, and then that will keep all your threads secure and you won't have to worry about them unraveling. Now I'm just going to go around all of my edges and finish with the edging with the ink. So I'm going to go around all of them, and then I'm even going to fold where my score marks are so that I can get ink on all of those, and just so then everything looks nice and consistent. Once that's done, then I'm inserting my album inside the cover. You see that I had to trim off the back a little bit. The front actually slid in very nicely, but because the piece at the back is added on, it's a little bit smaller. So I'm just trimming it down where I need to so that it fits in there really nicely. And then I realized that I made this flap and it covers up the front. So I'm going to tuck it inside instead. So what I wanted to do next was to put some elastic around it to secure it, kind of like a traveler's journal, something like that. So I took my crocodile, and then I have an eyelet that I'm just going to anchor in there. So you'll notice while I'm doing this that my book is still inside of there. So I decided it would be better to do it while the book was inside, because then that also acts as a fastener, and it keeps the book inside so that it's not falling out of the cover. So it kind of was a dual purpose there, and that worked out really nicely. So I didn't have any of that nice round elastic that you typically use on traveler's notebooks or journals, those kinds of things, but I did have this other piece of elastic, and it just happened to be the exact right size. So I tied a double knot in it, and then that fits very well into the eyelet. And then I decided the flap was a little bit bigger than I needed it to be, so I cut it off and I used my corner rounder to round the edges, and it works so easy with this Kraftex. So I decided I still wanted to do a little bit more decorating of the cover. So I found this lovely Vicky Bouton stencil that has this lovely "The Little Joys" saying on it. So I covered up the line above and the line below with some Scotch tape, and then I used Scotch tape just to tape it down there. And then this time I'm using the Close to My Heart black ink and my stencil brush, and I'm just running that through there to get that saying onto the spine. So I'm really happy with how that turned out. It just looks so great on there. And I decided I wanted to do the heart stencil on the back as well. So you saw me rubbing my stencil brush on some scrap paper because the black was still on it, and I should have used a different brush and I forgot. But anyway, I go ahead with the gray, and it was a tiny bit darker, but once it dried, it actually looks very similar to the front cover. So it really wasn't that big of a deal. And then I'm going to go ahead with the darker color again, put the stencil back on, and just highlight those bottom points of the hearts, just to give it a little bit of depth and interest. So I wanted to add a little bit more to the back, so something simple, and I found this stamp set with the stamp "I love you" to the stars and back. So I thought that would be really cute, and then there was also some little star stamps. So I'm going to add that stamp on there. Again, I am using the Distress black soot, I believe it is, and I'm just stamping that saying, and then I'm just random stamping some stars all over the back. So once I finish with all those little stars, then I'm going to take out my heat tool and I'm going to dry it again, because again, that Distress ink takes quite a bit of time to dry. So the heat tool will just speed that up so that I can move on to the next step, which is to decorate this little flap here. So I folded it over and scored it, and then I've inked that little fold. And now I just want to figure out what to put on that flap. So I found this Close to My Heart stencil. It has a nice little kind of I don't know, swirly wavy pattern on it. So again, I grabbed some Scotch tape. I'm sure you could use masking tape or, you know, like low tack tape, but the Scotch tape was handy. So I just grabbed it and my stencil brush, and this time I'm going to use the same gray color as I used for the hearts. And then it feels a little bit flat, so I pulled out some stamps from my stash. And this one has these tiny little stars, asterisks really, a couple of little shapes like that. So I've just got those, and I'm stamping on top of the circles that are on this stencil. And then I found another shape that's, I don't even know how to say it, like a cross kind of shape, but still like a star. And I put it on the little X's. There's 3 of those on this pattern, so I put that there. And then that just really makes this look a little bit more finished and match the rest of the album. Now my album is complete and ready for some pictures, which will come at a later date. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel, and have a wonderful day.